On the frigid morning of January 20th, 1961, on the heels of a snowstorm that had nearly shut down the entire city, John Fitzgerald Kennedy delivered what to this day is considered one of the greatest speeches in the history of the American presidency.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of your ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
The second youngest president after Theodore Roosevelt, and the first one born in the 20th century, the incoming 35th president had spent the previous evening bouncing from lavish gala to lavish gala, including one thrown by one of his biggest supporters, Frank Sinatra, a party attended by the likes of Betty Davis, Laurence Olivier, Nat King Cole, Gene Kelly, and Ella Fitzgerald. On the podium, along with Kennedy's family, were the two previous presidents, Truman and Eisenhower, along with the two men who would come to hold office for the balance of the decade and into the next, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Kennedy had selected 86-year-old former poet laureate Robert Frost to deliver a poem written for the occasion. But because of the bright winter sunlight, and despite Vice President-elect Johnson's valiant effort to shield the poem with his hat, Frost was unable to see clearly enough to read, and instead recited an older poem from memory.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
You have an individual who speaks with a kind of poetry. And I've said before, and everybody talks, this bold rhetoric of John Kennedy, this absolute duty to embrace challenge, the hard things to do, the difficult things to do, because we're young, because we have that energy. And Kennedy expressed that and looked like it. The image and the rhetoric were together and complemented each other perfectly. But that's the image. The thing is, John Kennedy, like so much in his life, is going to inherit many things that he wasn't particularly experienced with, but he'll have to handle them. And inheriting the presidency at the time that he inherited it, it's a perilous world that President Eisenhower had to tell him about in many ways.
I was 23 years old when President Kennedy was inaugurated. And it was the first time I had voted, because in those days you had to be 21 to vote. It was an exciting, just an electric time in our country. In retrospect, it was a real golden age, because after World War II, and all the sacrifice that people had made in order to win the war, we had an enormous confidence in our country and in everything that we could accomplish. And along came this handsome young man, a next generation from those who had been the leaders in our country, gorgeous wife, and so there was a tremendous sense, and I shared in it, of possibility and of transformation in our country. It was really a magic time.
I would suspect that when most people think of John Kennedy's very short presidency, there are several moments that are iconic. And without question, the inaugural speech is one of those moments. And I suspect that most people who know very little about John Kennedy can probably quote, the ask not what your country can do for you phrase, yes? And the image on that cold, morning, the frost in the air, and you see all the dignitaries on the stage, and most of them are heavily wrapped up in very warm coats. And President Eisenhower, older man, not particularly well, is really, bundled up. And here you've got John Kennedy, the president-elect, no top coat, no hat, no gloves, in the cold, frosty morning, looking very young, looking very healthy, looking very ready to go. And that image is just powerful. That image exudes so much of the bold rhetoric that will be in that speech. Lots of courage and boldness of the new frontier and new things. And his looks really advanced all of those words.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
He was always very good with bold rhetoric. Many people have identified, however, when you listen to the inaugural speech or read it, where's civil rights? Where is any kind of comment about that element? And that was just not on his radar. When Kennedy thought of race, as most people did, I suspect, at that time, the race they had most in mind is the one with communism and the competition in the world between the free world and the communist world. And that's what Kennedy spoke most about on that morning, that very iconic scene of taking the oath of office, a new generation, a new future.
The spirit of his speech rang loud and clear. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who served Kennedy as special assistant to the president, described the spirit of the first days of the Kennedy administration as being a flood of buoyant optimism, full of promise and hope. In reality, there were few significant achievements the first year of Kennedy's presidency. With the Senate controlled mostly by Southern Democrats and conservative Republicans, aside from raising the minimum wage and strengthening Social Security, few of his proposed legislation went through. He tried to compensate by using executive orders. Using the order, he created the first ever Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, as well as one of the most successful initiatives of his administration, the creation of the Peace Corps. As one of his first acts as president, on March 1, 1961, with Executive Order Number 10924, President John F. Kennedy created the Peace Corps. Each program participant, a Peace Corps volunteer, would be an American citizen, typically with a college degree, who worked abroad for a period of 24 months after 3 months of training. Volunteers worked with governments, schools, nonprofit organizations, non-government organizations, and entrepreneurs in education, hunger, business, information technology, agriculture, and the environment. After 24 months of service, volunteers could either opt out or request an extension of service.
The Peace Corps is a wonderful example of the sort of new thinking of John Kennedy. Coming as a new member of the new generation, John Kennedy clearly wanted to distinguish himself from some of the propositions and practices of the World War II older generation, especially that he saw in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the people who were generally responsible for much of the military action of the United States. The Peace Corps is an excellent example of avoiding the dangers of escalation and humiliation. The idea that you could have other options to combat challenges, especially communism in the third world, without military, without bombs, without that kind of high profile. The Peace Corps would be young, it would be volunteers, it's the young generation, they're going to be doing service, they're going to be providing vulnerable people with the abilities to combat the attractions of the communist world, teaching them how to farm, getting them running water, teaching them how to benefit themselves so they're not going to be vulnerable to the seductions of the communist rhetoric. It's absolutely perfect for John Kennedy. It's sort of a low radar. It's a new thinking. It energizes the young. It calls people into public service. And it's moderate. It's not something that raises the bar to calamity.
The organization grew to 5,000 members in 1963 and 10,000 the following year. Since 1961, over 200,000 Americans have served in the Peace Corps in more than 139 countries.
The other piece about the Peace Corps that will help John Kennedy is that so often we talk about how John Kennedy adjusted with the institutional Democratic Party, people like Eleanor Roosevelt or Truman or Hubert Humphrey. And the Peace Corps was really kind of a Humphrey initiative that John Kennedy was quite glad to co-opt and to advance in his new frontier. And I'm sure Humphrey was just fine with that.
In May 1961, after Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to fly in space that April, in an attempt to restart his presidency after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Kennedy gave a second State of the Union address. Among the proposals he made was a call for achieving the goal before the decade was out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. 3 weeks after the Soviet launch, Alan Shepard became the first American astronaut to travel into space. 9 months later, on February 20th, 1962, more than 1 million people watched John Glenn's rocket take off from Cape Canaveral on its way to circling the Earth 3 times, before landing safely in the Atlantic Ocean near Bermuda.
One of the principal things, of course, that's going to define John Kennedy's presidency in this period, the Cold War period, is the challenge with communism. And it is a race. Every part of the earth is going to be a challenge and a source of competition between the free world and the communist world. And that will extend even into outer space. Who will dominate that? I mean, there's no way you can exaggerate the fear, the menace, the threat that was popularly felt at that time of somebody getting the advantage.
Again, making clear his fear of falling behind the Soviets, on June 14, 1962, Kennedy warned in a press conference that the United States could not afford to become second in space or permit the Soviets to become dominant because of the unknown military implications. He re-emphasized this point 3 months later in September 1962 during a speech at Rice University.
Surely the opening vistas of space promise high costs and hardships, as well as high reward. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. But this city of Houston, this state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them.
The thought that the Soviets or the communists could beat us, could establish a foothold in outer space, was not just a question of bragging rights. It was an issue that said, oh, the Soviets, they have a superior system. Look what they've got. Look what they can accomplish. That would be humiliating to us, and that would be humiliating to the administration. And that would never be anything John Kennedy and his administration would tolerate, to look weak, to be humiliated. There had to be strength for strength. The other element, I mean, besides just the image of it and what it would say about our relative economic political systems, was the danger. The idea that we could be targeted from outer space and we couldn't challenge that, there is no way you could tolerate that. So for a number of reasons, and all related to that Cold War conflict, John Kennedy spoke boldly about going into space. And that's another one of the most iconic images. And most people remember about the John Kennedy administration with great fondness, the space program.
Even though I realize that this is, in some measure, an act of faith and vision, for we do not now know what benefits await us. But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out, then we must be bold. I'm the one who's doing all the work, so we just want you to stay cool for a minute. However, I think we're going to do it. And I think that we must pay what needs to be paid. I don't think we ought to waste any money, but I think we ought to do the job. And this will be done in the decade of the 60s. It may be done while some of you are still here at school at this college and university. It will be done during the terms of office of some of the people who sit here on this platform. But it will be done, and it will be done before the end of this decade. And I am delighted that this university is playing a part in putting a man on the moon as part of a great national effort of the United States of America. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there. And new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
The costs of the space program were enormous, but Kennedy justified them by arguing that the program was essential for international prestige as well as what might be learned for military advantage. In a September 1963 speech before the United States, Kennedy again urged, as he had in his first State of the Union address, for cooperation between the Soviets and Americans in space. But as he had before, Khrushchev declined. On November 16, 1963, just 6 short days before President Kennedy would be killed in Dallas, he made his third and what would be his final visit to Cape Canaveral, the home of his beloved space program. He was warmly welcomed by NASA Administrator James Webb and given a tour and briefing of the Gemini project by astronauts Cooper and Grissom. He stopped at the base of the Saturn, the rocket charged with meeting his goal of putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. From there, he boarded a helicopter for a 30-mile trip out to what is called Observation Island. The president was whistled aboard to watch his first missile launch. A Polaris launched from the submerged nuclear submarine, the Andrew Jackson.
A proud commander congratulated a proud crew.
The president commended the crew before returning to the Cape by helicopter.
I mean, it permeated everything, even food. I mean, you'd even have, space sticks and movies about space and TV shows about space. Very common. And that is one of John Kennedy's, I think, great legacies, is to get the United States in that race and get out there and compete with the Soviets.
On November 25th, the men and officers of the space and missile programs gathered at attention. The Cape was closed to memorialize the slain president. Brigadier General Henry J. Sams, Jr. spoke.
He moved among us with warmth and interest and awareness of our efforts. It is well to remember that we are assembled here today not because of the shocking way that he died, but because of and in tribute to the way he lived. We salute the memory of our late president, John F. Kennedy, and salute as well, in token of our steadfast devotion to duty, the new president and Commander-in-Chief, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Determined to move forward with the president's vision, the next evening a rocket platform was launched from the Cape, the space program's 21st consecutive successful launch. The next day, the Atlas Centaur launched without a hitch. On Thanksgiving Day, taking the advice of the slain president's wife Jacqueline, President Johnson issued an executive order renaming Cape Canaveral Cape Kennedy as a symbol of the United States' continuing commitment to President Kennedy's dream of a successful space program. On July 20th, 1969, almost 6 years after Kennedy's death, Apollo 11 landed the first manned space mission on the moon.